Good morning.
Doing
So,
well, thank you, Rabbi.
Nurit, where are you living, Nurit?
I live in Westboro, Massachusetts. It's a suburb of Boston.
Oh, wow. My brother's in Massachusetts.
Really, whereabouts?
Uh, like Amherst.
Amherst.
Yeah,
Oh,
he's
with
in Amherst.
UMass?
Yeah, so he oversees 5 campuses over there.
Oh, yeah, there's like Smith College
Right,
and
Smith, right, those 5 campuses, he's a shliach over.
oh, wow, small world. So I'm in central Massachusetts. That's western Massachusetts. It's beautiful over there.
How far is it from there?
I want to say like maybe an hour and a half or so.
Wow, okay. Okay, Beseda, Beseda, Beseda. If you're ever in town for Shabbat, join us. We're gonna have a good for bringing.
Yeah, I've been talking about that with Mariasha. I'm trying to get a group of ladies from my shul. We can come to the Ohel and maybe meet you there. Or like I could come for a Shabbaton, but I'll put something together definitely.
Which shul do you go to?
I go to the Torah Center. Are you familiar with the Fogelmans, the family in
Sure,
Massachusetts? Okay,
of course.
so Sheva Fogelman, she's the daughter of Herschel and Rachel Fogelman. So she started a shul with her husband. So that's where I go.
Herschel, oh, the grandfather,
Yeah,
the
that
senior
was her
shliach.
father, Herschel.
So when he passed away, right?
He passed away in 2013. Her mother
Right.
passed away last year. So Mendel, do you know Mendel Fogelman and Hani?
I don't. I knew him, and
Herschel.
yeah,
Okay.
he had a very, I mean, he's a legendary shliach.
Yeah.
But there was a particular story that is told over and over, and and suddenly is his name attributed to it. But when in it was it was in the, I believe, the mid 40s, if not towards the end of the 40s, and Herschel Frogelman was a Bucher, a young student in 770,
Mm-hmm.
and he was standing in the entrance of the main building of 770. The shul towards the right was added on later on. The main building was where the Rebbe's office is. And when
Mm-hmm.
you walk in, there right in front of you there are 2 doors, one leading to the hallway, and the other one the elevator to the previous Rebbe's apartment upstairs. And to the left is the Rebbe's office. To the right is the door to to the small zal, the small shul, as well as the secretariat's office.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, Rabbi Herschel Fogelman, alav shalom, as a young bacher, was standing with another rabbi who was also going to be who's going to be a legendary head shaliach. And they were standing over there, and the doors to the elevator open up, and the Rebbe, at that point, he was called the Ramash. That's an acronym for his name. And the Rebbe came out of the elevator and asked him, "Do you want to hear something that my father-in-law just told me?" And he says, "Yes, of course." And the Rebbe confided in them that he went to ask the previous Rebbe, his father-in-law, a foundational question. Judaism at that point in America was undergoing a metamorphosis. Of course, the Rebbe later on explained that this metamorphosis is, as we're learning right now, if looked upon and treated correctly, would bear fruits upon fruits upon fruits. Like the Rebbe once said in a talk in America, you can't tell people what to do, but you could inspire them, and then they'll do it.
Mm-hmm.
So the Rebbe, but on the surface level, assimilation took a very, very strong hold of American Jewry, to the extent that when Hitler, Yimach Shmo, was asked, "Do you really mean to destroy all of world Jewry? Do you think you're going to get to America?" And he said, I don't need to get to America. The soul of Judaism is right here, in Russia, in Europe. If you kill them off, American Jewry will die on itself, because American Jewry was hanging on a very thin line due to the Great Depression, et cetera, et cetera. There was in the religious communities, those who already moved here before the war or right after, there was a line that was being divided. There was a religious community, and then there were the Jews who were not interested in Judaism. The question was, what approach should be taken with them? As we know, our Rebbe's approach is one of love and belief, as we spoke about in the Tanya class last night, to talk up to the Jew. So the Rebbe showed, as this is his style, love and compassion and empathy to every single Jew. And there were many, many opinions that tried to discourage the Rebbe from taking this approach. Now, mind you, at that point, he was in his mid to late 40s. As the Rebbe took leadership in 1951, the Rebbe was 48, 49 years old. He was young. And the criticism came at the Rebbe that you're showing love and compassion to Jews who don't deserve it. They've abandoned Judaism, they're disgracing it, and showing them anything other than contempt is not the path that we should take, because it's going to sort of give a stamp of approval on them. However, the Rebbe has his methods. So this is a question he brought to his father-in-law, the Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, which is, should I change the course of my behavior and my style and approach towards the Jews who are seemingly on the fringes or altogether seemingly? In other words, should I heed to the advice and the criticism of all the other senior rabbis, et cetera, et cetera? And the previous Rebbe, his father-in-law, told him, and this is what he related to Rabbi Fogelman, says when a parent has a child, as we discussed in other classes, there's so much love that's born with that child, the capacity for love, the capacity for nurture, et cetera, et cetera. And just when the parent thinks that the capacity of love is maxed out, you're giving all this love and nurture and so on and so forth to the child, then another child comes about. Naturally, a person would think, well, I'm out of capacity. But with the next child, more love is born. What happens, the previous Rebbe continued, if God forbid a child is born with an impediment? God forbid he's maimed, he has a limp, his hands are not working, God forbid something in his mouth and his head. Does a parent love the child less because he's not the same as all the other children? Because he's defective? God forbid. Chaz v'shalom. Just the opposite. You show more love, more compassion, more empathy. The previous Rebbe says, so too with Hashem's children. If one of Hashem's child has a maim, has something in his feet, he doesn't walk to shul on Shabbat. He doesn't run to do a mitzvah. Or something with his hands, doesn't put on tefillin, he doesn't give tzedakah, et cetera, et cetera. Or something in his mouth, he doesn't eat kosher, he doesn't learn Torah, he doesn't daven. Or in his head, etc. just like a natural child in a natural state of parent to child connection, where there's something that hurts, you show more compassion, more love. So too, the previous Rebbe advised the Rebbe, so too when it comes to Hashem's children. Can't show them disdain, contempt. Hey, it's not their fault. This entire generation is deemed a tinok shenishba, a baby who was kidnapped and raised by wolves. It's not their fault. Who educated them? Who raised them? With all the turmoil that's going around. In a talk in I believe around Purim 1954, the Rebbe brought up a very interesting debate between himself and his father-in-law, where Chabad, the systematic approach of Chabad, unlike all the other Hasidism, the Polish Hasidism, which is like Chagat, Chesed, Gvur, Tiferes, the main difference is that all the other Hasidic dynasties, the Hasidim live on the verse, Tzaddik be'emunato yichya. A tzaddik lives with his emunah. Says, Al tikra yichya ela yechaya. Don't read the verse that a tzaddik lives with his emunah, but imparts life, imparts life and emunah into those who are connected to him. In other words, the other dynasties rely on the Rebbe to ignite them and to arouse their emotions and their intellect, etc., etc. Chabad is predicated on the person working on his own accord. Bekoach atzmo, with his own strength. Not to rely on tzaddikim to do your bidding for you. As the Rebbe himself said in the first talk after he accepted the leadership, after saying the discourse, Basel Agani, he says, you should know that I'm here to help you, but you cannot rely on the Rebbe's son-in-law. That's how the Rebbe referred to himself. He seldomly referred to himself as a Rebbe. He always called the previous Rebbe the Rebbe. You cannot rely on the Rebbe's son-in-law to do your bidding. I'm here to help you. And for that reason, the style of leadership of the Chabad Rebbeim was different than the Chagat Rebbeim, which is Chabad Rebbeim, and we have many stories and talks, etc., based on the following point. We don't rely on miracles. The Rebbeim did not fancy, for lack of a better word, showing open miracles. Because while a miracle is stirring and waking the neshama and it shows you, yes, there's a God, etc., but to a certain measure, it remains makifi, it remains encompassing. It's not internal because it didn't come from the inside. And there are many such stories that the Rebbeim refuse to rely on miracles to do the service, because the service has to be done in the confines of the physical world, the natural world. When there's absolutely no way, then yes, of course you do a miracle. Like we discussed several weeks ago, why the previous Rebbe, who could have just as easily melted the entire Shpalenka, the entire jail he was in. Or when the Alter Rebbe forbade his astute Hasidim from coming to visit him when he was arrested, because he realized that they have the power to completely dismantle the jail. But by divine providence, this is where the person is, and they have to mine naturally, not miraculously. all that is, it was a setup for what I'm about to say from that talk in Purim 1954, where the Rebbe brings a very interesting debate between himself and the Rebbe, the previous Rebbe. The miracles there were, but as the Rebbe himself says, we don't connect the Rebbe based on miracles. Yes, the Rebbe does miracles, but that's not what we connect to him. A body doesn't connect to the head because of any one feature. And the Rebbe is Rosh Bnei Yisrael. And nevertheless, the Rebbe opened up and revealed an interesting debate. The Rebbe requested from the previous Rebbe to start showing more miracles to the public. Because he says they need it. They need these miracles. They need to be aroused. They need to wake up. Yes, it's not our style, but we have to have Mesiras Nefesh to wake up the Jewish people. Anyway, that was just a very interesting Nakuda and a very interesting point regarding Rabbi Fogelman. Alav Shalom. All right, ready to begin? Yesterday, we discussed the driving question that we had was number one, why do we refer to this time period, Bein HaMesachim, between the dire straits, as the 3 weeks, not as Rashi deems it, the 21 days? What is it about the title 3 weeks that encapsulates the service of this time frame? Another point that was brought was that everything is absolutely good at all times, whether it's discernible or not, whether we understand it or not, being that this is Hashem's world. Every frame of reality is internally good, no matter how it presents itself on the surface. And we went so far as to say that even the defense mechanisms that we employ has goodness in it. It's just up to us to mine for it, rather than using it in an unhealthy manner, unholy manner. We have to learn what is it that we're trying to tell ourselves. For example, I'll give you an example. Last night, after the Tanya class, we came home, and I went to start editing some of the music, etc. Ilana had some things to do to research for tonight's class, and her daughter woke up. Her 7-year-old daughter. She came to the door, knocked, and Ilana told her that she's going to come check in on her soon. 20 minutes go by, and her daughter came back to the room, this time crying. I opened a door and I asked what was happening. She said, Mommy, she started crying. I said, hold on 1 second. I want to hear what you have to say, but I can't understand what you're saying. So you have one of two choices. Either you could stop crying, and I would really want to hear what you have to say, or you could go to bed. She chose to go to bed. But I recognized that this is a child. And a child seldomly have coping mechanisms. So I recognized that was a reaction. So I followed her to the room. I sat by the bed. And I told her, look, I understand that something's upsetting you. And I really want to understand what is it. And she said, Mommy told me she's going to check up on me in 20 minutes. And she didn't. I responded, that part I understood. What I really want to understand, I want to help you understand this. Why is that driving you to cry right now? What are you feeling? And she repeated, Mommy told me, I said, that part I get. The mechanics I get. I didn't tell her the word mechanics, but told her that part I get. I definitely understand that part. But I would like her to understand on a deeper level what's bothering you about that. She thought about it for about 30 seconds. She said that I was scared. I said, okay, that's a valid emotion, but let's understand. What were you scared about? She said she doesn't know. Were you scared that something happened to mommy? She said, no. She says, were you scared that something happened and would happen to you or to your sisters? She said, no. So I said, so what were you scared of? Because that's what we need to address. We went back and forth. And what I was able to draw from her is the fact that he was not so much scared as much as feeling not loved. So very interestingly, I said, wait a second, but mommy's with you all day, everything mommy does, she does for you. She wakes up early with you, gives you the cereal, gives you the food, drives you to camp, goes to work, gives classes, sits into classes, helps you, makes you dinner. We sit together with dinner every single evening. Mommy loves you so much. And when your mommy and I talk, it's always about how to improve your life. But I can understand how mommy telling you she's going to beep in 20 minutes and she wasn't, how that could make you feel what you're feeling. However, there's something else. Mommy needed a break. Mommy had a long day and she just needed a break. But not from you, God forbid. And then I said, let's think, when you come from school, after a long day in school, if you have homework or a chore and you know you need to get to it, but you need some time, you need just to relax, whatever it is. Does that ever happen to you? She said, yes, it does. And so I asked her, when you take that break, are you trying to take a break from mommy or from your Abba? She said, no, I need that break. I said, that's exactly it. Mommy's taking a break, but not from you. Mommy's taking a break so she could be a better mommy for you. She loves you so much. But mommy, and it's normal to need a break from time to time. And usually mommy takes that break later on. But I said, Chaya, I want you to think, I want you to recognize something. Next time, and if you do this, you're going to be unstoppable in life. Next time you feel this fear or anger, whatever it is, first and foremost, ask yourself, Chaya, what's scaring you? What's bothering you? Not the outside. Really what's bothering you so we could address that. What is it about the situation that's bothering? Not just the mechanics, the underpinning. Then I promised that she could go with her mom to go choose snacks for Shabbat, recipes for Shabbat, and make it. And then she was ready to go sleep. But why am I telling you? Because in that moment, when the defense layer comes up, it's not just coming up by the way. Although on the external surface level, we know we have triggers, unhealed wounds, etc., as we discussed in many other classes. But understand, as per our discussion, that every moment, every instant is God-given, and every single element that fills in that moment is driven by God out of his benevolence, including, as we discussed last week's classes, even the parts of confusion are brought up by God. The question is, what do we do about it from our own perspective and without utilizing our own powers? When a defense mechanism comes up, there's two ways of dealing with it. First of all, push it away. It's hiding you. It's literally an armor that perhaps doesn't even belong in your repertoire anymore. It has just become the natural go-to based on muscle memory. But certainly it doesn't, one can recognize that it doesn't resolve any particular dilemmas that the person is feeling in that moment. Just the opposite, it pushes the resolution away. So from that perspective, a person can say, well, I know what I feel, but I could also choose not to act upon it. We tell our children all the time, and we discussed last night's Tanya class, it's okay to feel upset, etc., etc. It's not okay to say it in an upset way. It's not okay to act it in an upset way. One course of action is, I know I'm triggered. I know my defense mechanism want to come up right now, but what's actually necessary is iskafia, subjugation. On the other hand, and not every time we could do this, and sometimes it's very difficult to do this unless we're very, very, very set in Torah. And we know that. One path instructs us not to entertain these negative things at all. Yes, we're prone to it, but not to entertain it. The siach da'atomis, I think I've said many times, divert your mind from this. You don't have the power to deal with this right now. As a matter of fact, you try to deal with it, it's going to bring you down. Rather, focus on the light. And the more light and is revealed within yourself. In other words, focus on what works. Focus on the goodness. The more we amplify the light, the less room there's darkness for there's darkness, most of the time. So if the person finds himself repeatedly dealing with certain negative thoughts, words, etc., there's one style that says iskafia. Subjugate it. Subjugate the impulse. As we discussed in last week's class, in the mitzvah, with you should love Hashem, your Lord. In other words, whatever He's giving you, with all your heart, with both of your hearts. The one, as Rashi says, one side of our heart is dedicated to the good inclination, the other one is the evil inclination. So, on the plain level, on the surface level, to love Hashem with a yes or hara means, as we discussed last week, to as soon as a yes or hara brings up its suggestions, its opinions, iskafia, subjugation. Don't give it expression. Do anything else, but not that. No matter how sensible it is in that moment, as we discussed last night's Tanya, ask yourself, who is talking here? Which side of me is suggesting this course of behavior? Which side of me is thinking, which side of me is communicating, is talking, and which side of me is behaving? Is it the real me or is it my animal soul? And if you still cannot determine, ask yourself a very, very valid question. One, that if you do determine either direction, At some point, it will happen. Ask yourself, if I was in front of the Rebbe, would I say these words? Would I take this approach? Would I confidently be able to stand in front of my grandchildren and say that this is the best way to handle life? You could ask your grandparents and your grandchildren, what do they think you should be doing right now? What does the previous generation need you to do? Because after all, you're a chain and a link. And what does the upcoming generation need you to do? Because you're you're the link. Anyway, so what we were saying, that even the defense mechanisms have a reason. The higher level of the Cholavavcha, with all of your hearts, is to take that incongruency and elevate it. And that's not always easy. For that reason, we're not instructed to always take that course. Because sometimes the suggestion to deal with this incongruency could emanate from the Yetzirah itself. Recognizes you won't be able to deal with it, and you'll fall into a snare. And this requires, to speak, to know, and so on and so forth. But the higher level is to take that and utilize it to grow further. So, for example, the way it's explained in Chassidus is, if the Yetzirah incites passion with you towards something not good, passion itself is not bad. It's just a question in which direction is the passion being driven. Who's the driver? There's an anecdote I heard maybe 7, 8 years ago. 2017, something like that. The Pope arrives in New York, and a limo is ready to pick him up. Pope asks the driver, "Would you let me drive?" I've never driven before. I've never had the privilege of driving. I know how to drive, but they don't let me drive in Rome. Would you let me drive? Whatever you ask. Pope gets behind the wheel and slams. He puts all of his oomph of not driving for years into this one drive. To the extent that he is pulled over by the police for speeding. The officer approaches the car, license and registration, please. Window opens. The police officer can't believe what he's seeing. He's seeing the Pope driving. So immediately he calls base to have a dilemma. I don't know what to do. I stopped someone, and I don't know how to proceed. I don't know if I should give a ticket or not. So this is, who is it? Is it Trump? In other words, who's in the back over there? Is it Trump? He says no. Is it this one? Is this one? Each one says no. I don't know. And in the end, he says, I don't know who it is, but I could tell you one thing: the guy is so important that the Pope himself is driving him. What is the anecdote? Who is the driver? The more prestigious a driver, the more the cargo must be that more important. When we get enticed, when we get heated up, means behind that must be something very important. Question: who's the driver? And in that sense, says the Torah, Chassidus that if a person feels enticed, passionate, it's not the passion that's wrong. Utilize it, but utilize it towards the correct direction. Make sure it's not the animal that's driving it, because the animal doesn't know how to think. It only knows how to emote and emote on an immediate basis. 1 second is happy, the next second is completely insane. But with all that, what we left off was that every frame, even galut, even exile in itself, is not a means towards achieving geula, the redemption. But rather, as we discussed yesterday, the fact that exile has reigned for such a long time with everything that it brought, the darkness and the pain and so on and so forth, in itself is an indication of how much light is in this time frame. It's just as we discussed yesterday, we're not given the ability to understand it, because if we understood how good it is, how good exile is, in other words, not because of, God forbid, the material comfort, but simply because we have the opportunity to transform darkness and the sparks. Well, we're not going to have that when Mashiach comes. Mashiach time is like Shabbat. Once Shabbat enters, whatever's done is done. You can't cook more. Whatever wasn't done throughout the week, now is going to have. Now it's done. So too, Mashiach will come. The service, as we understand it, is going to be finished. There's no more Yesahara, no more challenges, no more conflicts. God is going to be revealed overtly, to the extent, as the prophet says, that Hashem himself is going to teach us Torah in an open, manifest way, not from books. The service over at that time is going to be like the service on Shabbat, like the ultimate service of the couple. Oneness. Not about creativity, not about doing, but just oneness. It's a whole different level. It's like Shabbat, but that's why Mashiach is called, the period of Mashiach is called a day that's completely Shabbat. That's utterly, that's wholesomely and completely and utterly Shabbat. With that, having said this, the moments of exile, as painful as they may be, bear within the most remarkable opportunities of light. As a matter of fact, the Alter Rebbe brings in a discourse, connected to Megillas Esther, that as we discussed in the Purim time, the Alter Rebbe explains that Esther, the name Esther wasn't her name as we know. Her name was Hadassah. She was called Esther because she had to conceal her identity. She couldn't overtly tell King Achashverosh that she was Jewish. As a matter of fact, we see in Purim, the theme is concealment. As we discussed, the Megillas Esther, that the Shkol of Esther is the only body of Torah that doesn't bear Hashem's name even once. And that's because Purim, Esther concealed, Hashem was concealed. We know that we dress up on Purim to show, in order to exemplify that concealment. We eat Hamantashen, a cookie that for the most part conceals its inner content. But nevertheless, it's not called Esther. It's called Megillat Esther, the scroll of Esther. And as Alter Rebbe explains, and as Broder Chassidus, Megillah comes from legalot, to reveal. Megillah means to reveal. Megillat Esther, as Alter Rebbe explains, is to reveal that which is concealed. Again, Esther, as the Gemara says, and I do believe we discussed it in that time and around Purim time. Esther, the Gemara asks, Esther minater minayin, where does the name Esther come from in the Torah? And she said, and the Gemara says, from the verse that we mentioned yesterday, when Moshe Rabbeinu prophesies about the end times, Moshe Rabbeinu says, in that day I will conceal my face from them. In other words, regarding the time right before Mashiach, the concealment is going to be so dark and gloomy that those who live through that concealment won't even recognize that it's a concealment. They will think that this is a norm. This is a standard. Says the Gemara, the name Esther is referencing exactly that. A time of utter concealment, where nothing is visible. So we don't see Hashem's name appear in Megillat Esther, not even once, which is the only book, again, of the Torah that doesn't bear Hashem's name. We see the heroine of the story, Esther, in a deep dark in a state of concealment. She has to conceal herself. And when you read the events from beginning, Vahi b'yimei Achashverosh, and it was the days of Achashverosh, the king Achashverosh, who presided over 127 provinces, all the way to the last words that Mordechai is desired and wanted and admired by his brethren, to all of his brethren. It seems what is known like a pulp fiction. It's a bunch of random events being tied together, seemingly with no cohesion. And the Megillat Esther takes place over 14 years, from beginning to end. But as we discuss around Purim time, the Gemara questions, how much does a person, or from where does a person have to hear, or how much does a person have to hear from the reading of the Megillah in order to fulfill their mitzvah? There are certain opinions. One says from the introduction of Haman, because that's the introduction of the pain, of the antagonist. Another one from the introduction of Mordechai, Ish Yehudi Haya b'Shushan, because that's already the solution before the pain. Another one says, Balaylahu nidash nasamelech, and that night the king's sleep was disrupted, couldn't sleep, causing him to open up the ledger, which recalled Mordechai's saving his life, which began the ultimate miracle. And the miracle began when he couldn't sleep. But Rabbi Meir Balanes tells us the entirety of the Megillah, from beginning to the end. Incidentally, why is his name Rabbi Meir? And the Alter Rebbe explains Al Shem she'ir et einei hachachamim, that he was illuminated the eyes of the sages. He was able to see the halacha, the law, the Jewish, the law in itself, in its spiritual origins, in Atzilut. So Rabbi Meir says the entirety. And the Alter Rebbe explains, and the Rebbe explains why. Because although it seems like a pulp fiction, but every detail is godly and intertwined. Every detail is another note in the symphony. You can't skip. The Alter Rebbe explains the entire Megillas Esther is actually a very deep, charged conversation between the neshama. Esther represents the soul in an utter and dire strait of concealment. And although Hashem's name is not overtly mentioned in Megillat Esther, Yud Ke Vav Ke Elokim Kel, but he is referred to throughout the entire Megillah. It's called the Melech, the king. The king. The king says to Esther, the king says to this, who's the king? It's Hashem. Not only that, Chassidus goes even Achashverosh, that the Achrit Vereshit. Achashverosh is Achashverosh. Achrit Vereshit. The end and the beginning are mine, which is Hashem. Ancient. So the entire Megillas Esther is a conversation between Hashem, between us, the Neshama, and Hashem. And each character over there, each persona, is part of the service. Haggai, the one who brought Esther to the pageant, he chose her for the king. That is Higayon logic. Batim Sachein, and she found grace in front of the king. Chen is an acronym Chochma Nister. This is the Neshama. There, between each heaven, between each firmament, there's, for lack of a better word, an elevator. And that elevator is Chochma Nister, the hidden wisdom. The Neshama has to rise up from one level to another. Anyway, the reason why I'm bringing this is because when Esther invited Achashverosh to the Farbrengen and Haman, and Mendel brought up many times, you see the entire transformation begins with a Farbrengen. Not just one, you have another one. So she invited him to the feast twice. And upon the second time, when it was revealed what was happening, Esther asked Achashverosh, as he said already several times, when she invited him first time, second time, what did he say? Ask for anything. I'll give you up to half of the kingdom. What did she ask for? She says, now you know the truth. Now you know the plot, that you sealed the fate of my people, including me. What I would like for you to do is rescind your decree. The decree was that on the 14th of Adar, every single Jew living in Achashverosh's 127 provinces would be murdered. In other words, it would be a one-day Holocaust. And Achashverosh had that kind of reach. So she said, rescind the decree. What was his answer? I will not. For any decree that was sealed with the royal insignia and issued out cannot be rescinded. What I can do for you, however, is to allow you to write your own decree, a secondary decree. Write whatever you want, and I will seal it with my royal insignia and immediately send it out. And that, until that point, the Jews weren't allowed to defend themselves as part of the decree. Here, the Jews were able to not only defend, but to wage war to wage war against those who were coming at them as defense. And that began the whole entire transformation. As the Gemara says, the mouth that uttered, do whatever you want to the Jewish people, to Haman, is now uttered to Esther, write whatever you want and I will sign it. The house of Haman became the house of Mordechai. As we discussed, Purim is the ultimate transformation of darkness to light. When you don't see God, and everything's concealed, and everything's painful, and God forbid the decrees. But the entire purpose is to reveal. And that required inner work. It was required for us to take responsibility for ourselves. And this was the first time we collectively took responsibility for Judaism since our birth as a nation in 2448. Until that point, Hashem was doing our bidding, Moshe Rabbeinu, the leadership was doing, the Kohanim were doing, the Levian. This is the first time we're exiled out of our land, strewn around throughout different vicinities. No Beit HaMikdash, no service, no Kohanim. Behind us was the Babylonian, the Holocaust of the Babylonians, the Iraqis, destroyed the Beit HaMikdash, destroyed Yerushalayim, exiled us from Yerushalayim. The pain and the suffering and so on and so forth. And yet we were forced to grow up. But then comes a question. If the entire conversation, if time Megillas Esther is a conversation between the Neshama in a time of darkness and concealment and Hashem, how are we to understand that Hashem says, I will not rescind the decree against my own people? The Alter Rebbe gives us a powerful, powerful explanation. What Hashem was telling Esther is that everything that happened thus far was my decree. And I will not rescind it because you needed this. You needed to go through this in order to come to the point where you could now be my co-creator. If I would rescind the decree, it might have been easier for you, yes. But that's not the point. I give you reality. Your aim is to develop that reality. A husband and wife. A husband gives us the potential, and the wife develops it. Hashem gives us the potential, and it's up to us to develop it. So even events and experiences which are painful and so on and so forth, all of them are here from Hashem. And the darker it seems means behind it, underneath it, there's a tremendous amount of light. And for that reason, instead of, God forbid, shutting down or getting angry and so on and so forth, and that's what I advised I advised my stepdaughter last night, instead of reacting, which is normal, natural, it's okay to be afraid. It's okay to feel like this. It's fine. I get it. But you will be unstoppable if you could think about why are you feeling this way and actually address that. Because even behind the defense mechanisms, there's light. So if we were to stop ourselves before reacting to exile, as we discussed yesterday, what bothers us in any given situation is that we don't see its purpose. We don't see the light. We definitely feel the pain. We definitely see the limitations, et cetera, but we don't see the light. We don't see the light because Hashem doesn't allow us to, because from a service perspective, that would undermine Hashem's desire for us to come and mine the situation for its true and essential form, which is light. But that requires us, with our human limitations, not seeing. And I do believe that that is, to a certain extent, the greatest miracle of all. That limited human beings with limited mindsets and limited emotional capacity, living in a world where, as the Torah deems, the godliness is so limited that the evil this world is considered not just concealment, but a concealment so dark and gloomy that the evil reigns supreme and goodness is just few and in between. And yet, this is where we were sent, front lines. And as we're getting closer to the Mashiach, we are the front lines of the front lines. But as we discussed many times before, Azer panim lagehenom, the Mishnah says, uboshes panim lagan Eden. Those who are audacious, chutzpahdik, are sent to Gehenom. Those who are timid and etc., they are sent to heaven. But the Kosker Rebbe explains that those strong neshamot, that are strong in the neshama, the more Gehenom is going to experience. The timid neshamot are given a relatively easy life, but not as a reward or a punishment God, just simply based on capacity. As we discussed many times, the first graders getting first grade homework and tests and problem solving because that's their capacity. The reward of mastering first grade, and incidentally, that's how it works in life, is not seemingly to go higher. It's actually to go lower. That's height. I remember one of my, I used to have a student here, his name was Osher Kravitsky, Babu Sali's grandnephew. This guy understood Hasidus so impeccably when we learned with him. And remember, we were discussing a point around this, around a certain point that is nogea, as pertains to what we're discussing, and he showed me a video. There was an Israeli Air Force pilot who was doing training in his jet. And mid-training in the air, he experienced vertigo and passed out. When he woke up, he was still not, his entire sense, all of his senses were off. In his mind, what was down is up and up and down. So he thought he was crashing. He woke up realizing that he might be crashing. So he pulled the plane downwards, thinking that he's climbing upwards because his internal balance was all completely off. And he was so high in the sky that it was nothing was visible. So he didn't see. But the tower was repeatedly calling his attention. You are rapidly descending. Turn around, climb up. And he says, no, I am climbing upwards. And they said, no, you are crashing. And he says, I'm not. I'm going upwards. He says, your training tells you, look at your gauge, your airplane gauge. What is it telling you you're going? Are you climbing or are you descending? And indeed, it shows he was descending. Part of their training is when you're not sure which direction, look at the gauge. So too, when we find ourselves in a situation, first and foremost, we have to, what does the Torah say about this? Not what I see with my eyes, not even what I'm feeling right now. All that has to be understood from the lens of the Torah. As the expression is, there are some people who look at the world and then try to understand how could the Torah says this was clearly that doesn't fit in with the world. That's backwards. In other words, first they notice their own world, the concealment, what they're feeling, what this and that, and this and that. And then, by the way, there's also a Torah. But what's relevant is what I see, what I feel, etc., etc. Torah tells you just the opposite. First you look at the Torah, and then you look at the world. Our aim in Golus is to mine Galut for its sparks, for the converts, right? We discussed this last week. Tammuz says that the only reason that the Jewish people were scattered amongst the world is to increase converts to the Jewish people. As we discussed last week, converts doesn't mean humans. Converts are sparks that are so deeply ingrained within exile that overtly doesn't look like it has anything to do with Hashem or Torah or anything like that. Just like a convert has a Jewish spark in them, but overtly they weren't born to Jewish parents and they weren't raised in a Jewish setting, but deep inside there's that spark, the potential, and it has to be brought out. And again, I'm going to say something that we learned last week. In davening, in Psukei de Zibra, Hashem shomer gerim. Hashem protects, guards the converts. And again, as we discussed, the converts here is referring to what we're saying to Hashem is that any spark that we mind that we mine and we transform, the Yetzer Hara is going to immediately try to pull them back in. That's why we ask Hashem, anything that I've transformed, please guard it. Don't let it go backwards. So how are we to understand this bitter exile, and specifically this 3 weeks, Bein HaMetzarim, between the dire straits? The Tzemach Tzedek's commentary to Megillat Eicha, the scroll of lamentation that we read traditionally on Tisha B'Av, says the Tzemach Tzedek, every single word, Every pasuk is actually hinting to the ultimate redemption, to light. For example, we say, Kol Rotfeha, all of its pursuers, referring to Eicha, that's what it says. All of its pursuers, the pursuers of the Jewish people, caught up with her, with the Jewish people, in between the dire straits, between Shiva Sabbat Tammuz, the 17th of Tammuz, and Tisha B'Av. Says the Tzemach Tzedek, what is the innate meaning behind it? On the outskirt means that our enemies caught up with us and they destroyed everything. Says that's the surface level. What's the internal? Shekorot Feya, that all of its pursuer. Who are the pursuers? It doesn't say the Babylonians, the Romans, the Greeks, the Assyrians, whatever. It doesn't say that. All. Who's pursuing us? Says the Tzemach Tzedek, this is actually referring to a verse in chapter 23 of Tehillim, of the Psalms. What does David HaMelech says? Ach tov v'chesed yiridufuni. Goodness and kindness will pursue me always. Says the Tzemach Tzedek that Kol Rotfeya, all of its pursuers caught up with her, Israel, the Jewish people, during this time means the kindness, the goodness and the kindness, Hashem's goodness and kindness is pursuing us right now. V'sigua, and what is that? And they caught up and caught up and grabbed us during the time between the dire straits. What does that mean? Bein HaMetzarim, between the dire straits, is hinting to a very, very essentially lofty origins of the light. It's called in Kabbalah Chassidut Meitzar HaElyon, the divine straight constriction. What is divine constriction? We discussed before that in order to reveal, there has to be the ability to reveal. There has to be layers of revelation, more and more and more or less degrees of revelation. Obviously, the light that is closest to the luminary, to the light bulb, is going to be the most intense, and as the light descends, it gets less and less diffused in the environment. However, that's in Revelation. We discussed in previous classes, atzmi, davar atzmi, essence, cannot, by definition, reveal. Etzem, the pirush, the translation of etzem. So we know our bone is called etzem. Why? Because it's the strongest, most sturdiest part of us. Etzem bilti mishtane, mitchalek bilti mishtane, says a previous rabbinic discourse. Etzem, essence, does not fluctuate. It doesn't grow. It doesn't diminish. The Meitzar Elyon, the divine constriction, this is referring to the essence, because it cannot reveal. It cannot reveal. Says, however, the Tzemach Tzedek, the goodness and kindness is pursuing us and will grasp us, get us when Bein HaMetzarim. between the dire straits. So let's look at footnote number 17 over here. The Tzemach Tzedek continues that drawing from Hametarel, the supernal strait. How does one do this? What's the mechanics? How does one connect to this? If it's beyond connection, how do you connect to something like that? Says the Rebbe as follows: the day's bonanut is first and foremost to meditate, to contemplate that all of the worlds, from the highest of the highest to the lowest of the low, and everything between that, they're just one drop in front of you, just one drop. Meitzaki pshuto, it's literally a strait. And it explains that Beina Metzarim, between the straits, like between the 17th and 9th Tisha B'Av, is called between the Metzarim. Beina Metzarim is a supernal state. Who Beit B'china Metzarim is two types, the two restrictions, the two straits. The fact that Shal Yedei V'yesh Lomar Jezeh Shal Yedei Metzaki Pshuto, first and foremost, why would Hashem give us dire straits? Why did Hashem give us painful times? Again, yesterday we discussed that in order to resolve, it's not enough to embrace the light while having resentment and pain harboring in it, which in any given moment just could come out, but rather dissolve into the light. In other words, they need to be completely and utterly bottled to the light, not the solution of self, but the solution of ego, not as a bad thing, recognizing how good you are, how important you are, how powerful you are. And all that's from Hashem. So we have to be completely and utterly bottled to Hashem. But what's the point of giving us an exile and painful? And how do we dissolve? What's the mechanism? How could we reconcile good God and pain, loss of children, loss of this and loss of that, and Holocaust and October 7th and this? And how do we explain this? So we can reconcile, so we can serve Hashem out of happiness. Says the Tzemach Tzedek. First and foremost, what is the aim of constriction? What is the aim of the dire straits? The entire, says the Tzemach Tzedek, the entire restriction, the entire pain, and so on and so forth, that feeling choked, feeling that we can't be ourselves, all of that is actually deriving from its origin, the divine mitzvah, the divine constriction. Why? It's not only because when a person finds himself in such a situation, the calling to Hashem and the screaming to Hashem is so much more intense. Literally, dvarim hayotzim min halev, words that come up from the Jewish heart. Hashem, where are you? It's not only because Hashem wants us to call out. In other words, to reveal Him in this situation. To call out, Hashem, where are you in this? Let me mine. And utilize that pain and so on and so forth to look deeper and deeper. But the source of all of this is in essence of Hashem, and because of that, it doesn't come in a way that we can understand, because essence doesn't reveal itself. The way to be able to sweeten it is by first and foremost recognize it's all Hashem. If it's all Hashem, it must be good. Not to get distracted by the incongruencies. They are part of the service. One direction or another. We know that right before the Rebbe brings in an asterisk to the footnote, that right before we blow the shofar, we call out, we cry out, Min ha-meisa karasi yudke anani v'mechav yudke. From the dire streets, I call upon you, Hashem, Yudke. Answer me with abundance, Yudke. Why? Because Shorasho Hametza, because the source of this dire straits, from the dire straits, Hashem, I call upon you, is the supernal dire straits. And actually, the supernal straits is exponentially higher than the supernal abundance. We say, Min ha-meita, from the constriction, from the dire straits that I'm experiencing, that originates in your straits, in essence. Answer with abundance. Says the Rebbe something powerful. Powerful. Because I call upon you from the straits that I'm going through, which originates in the straits in Shamayim, which supersede, which transcends even the greatest abundance that we call. We say, Anani bevechav Yudke. Answer with abundance, Yudke, Hashem. It's actually a logic. Because I call upon you from the dire straits, and those dire straits come from your straits. The dire straits themselves could push and stream abundance. Because the straits themselves come from a much higher level. They have the ability to push. And that's the entire purpose of it. And being that the entire Kriya, as the Rebbe continues, being that the entire straits, when a person has these things, first of all, you should check, how am I doing? Where am I, like, God forbid, a car that hits the grooves on the side of the road, it says you're veering off. Wake up. When a person experiences these kinds of, first and foremost, am I myself? Am I conducting myself correctly? Am I thinking correctly? Saying correctly? Hashem's trying to get my attention there. So that screaming out to Hashem is not, Hashem, help. Of course there is. But that screaming, says the Rebbe, is actually the beginning of tshuva. Anani v'mechav, answer me with abundance, is, as it says, even before, the prophet says, even before they call upon me, I already have the answer for them. And this is tshuva. When a person, when the abundance is shamayim, and the divine abundance feels when the kasher nirgash b'amechav shelamayla haratzon likom min ha-meitzah, when the abundance in shamayim feels that there's a desire to connect because of this dire straits, it in itself, as it were, compels abundance to start streaming immediately. And this is beyond the nature. The abundance that comes from that is way beyond nature. So the Rebbe continues in the footnote that, as we know, that the Talmud tells us that the second that the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, Mashiach was already born. And it's very interesting because the Gemara describes that when the Romans entered to destroy the Beit HaMikdash, the Kruvim, the cherubs that were perched upon the Aron, not only were not turned away from each other, they were embracing towards to each other. We know that the cherubs had an indication of our connection to Hashem. When the Jewish people and Hashem were like in a healthy state of marriage, the cherubs were towards each other. When we were, God forbid, the opposite, they too were turned away. It's very interesting because when the Goyim walked in, when the Romans walked in to the Beit HaMikdash, or the Babylonians, they saw the cherubs towards facing each other, which showed that, as a matter of fact, even at a moment of exile, of the deep darkness where it's about to enter, Hashem loves us, and we're still one with Him. Nothing changed. Now, how do you understand this? On one hand, it's Hashem who compelled them to destroy the Beit HaMikdash, to send them into exile. How do we reconcile the fact that the Kruvim were embraced towards each other? Says there could be something powerful. What Hashem was showing us, this is not coming out of Chas v'Shalom punishment. This darkness is meant to produce light. And from that very moment, all of Geulah, and the Geulah and the potential of redemption in every single frame of reality throughout the time of Golus was born. In several Farbrengens, we discussed David HaMelech's bemoaning, Be'emor alai kol hayom hayeh Elokecha. When they say to me, all day long, my tears, Haisali Dimas in chapter 42 of Tehillim, my tear was bread and water day and, I'm sorry, my tears were bread day and night. When they say to me, where's your God? And we discussed it at length. What does that mean? Where's your God? Not where God is. Where's your God? We discussed this at length. But after learning the Sikha, on Shabbat, when I was walking to Shul, I was reviewing it in my head. And I thought, and it popped it to me. It doesn't say, Ayet Havaya. Where's your Havaya? Yud-Kid Vav-Kid. Elokecha. Said, first and foremost, Elokim is a name of constriction, of tzimtzum. It's equivalent to nature, Hateva. 86. But it's also, as we discussed in the previous Rebbe's discourse, kochenu v'chiyasenu. It's our life force. Ayeh Elokecha could also mean bechor. What did you do with the contraction that was given to you? That contraction in itself bore your greatest strength, your greatest achievements. But you were meant to utilize that, not to be despondent because of it, shut down. That was your portal upwards. What did you do with it? Reacting just because that's the way it seems on the outside Not only does it resolve, it complicates. Saying this contraction, the darker the contraction, the more light's available. The more the growth. And that's what Lechora David HaMelech is crying about. Where's your Elokim? Elokecha Elokim. Tzimtzum we see everywhere. What did you do with it? How did you utilize it to grow? Not to ignore, not to push away, not to destroy further, not to shut down. How did you utilize this moment? Because if this moment, as I said, this moment is brought to you by, this moment was brought to you by essence. You want to go up? You wanted a promotion? Here it is. What is it? The Tammuz says, as someone who comes to purify gets divine assistance. A person who takes upon himself to bring purity to the world gets divine assistance. Someone who comes to contaminate, however, the Tammuz says, open up. Says, what does that mean, open up? Means very simple. We're not going to help you mess up. We're not going to help you contaminate. In purifying, we'll help you. You do your best, and we'll take care of the rest. But in the opposite, we're not going to help you. We're going to open. You want to fall? We'll open the floor for you. Fall as deep as you want. Chassidus says, well, hold on. I mean, logic, we get that, but after all, this is our Father. Our infinite Father who loves us infinitely, which means infinitely. Nothing takes away from infinity. A billion sins cannot take away from infinity. Hashem's patience, as Dr. Rebbe says, are infinite, not like us. Hurt us once, we'll forgive. Second time, fourth. At a certain point, you say, wait a second. How much more? But not to Hashem. For that reason, as Dr. Rebbe says, we say 3 times a day, Chanun Amar B'Yislech, B'Ochata Hashem, Chanun Amar B'Yislech, with Hashem's name, that Hashem forgives us. And as Dr. Rebbe says, if Hashem didn't forgive us, it would be a brachala b'tala, it would be a blessing in vain, where we're not allowed to say it. But the fact that we say it is that Hashem forgiven us 3 times a day. So comes a question, wait a second, this is a Father who loves us infinitely. Will open up the floor for us to fall? That's what a loving Father does. Sees his child wants to mess up, he says, you do whatever you want, I'm through with you. God forbid. Not even a fleshy, a father of flesh and blood would do that. That's cruel. We do everything possible to not to allow them to fall like that, especially if it's a spiral. Says Chassidus, no. The depth of this is something very powerful. Someone who comes to purify gets divine assistance. Someone who comes to contaminate, open up for him. What do they open up? Open for me, just a pinhole, and I'll open you an entire hole. Or open for me the gates of righteousness, I should come through them. Says Chassidus something powerful. What is being open? When you want to do something wrong. When you find yourself in a situation where you have all the reasons to, and so forth. And you're already engaged, you're already saying something wrong, you're already doing something. In that moment, a portal is opening up. That's what's opening. Not a floor so you can fall, a portal that if you respond correctly now, this is your portal upwards. This is your promotion. Because the origin that we just said, of this incongruency, of this pain, and the darker and the more painful it is in the divine constraints. And this divine consciousness is actually much higher than any abundance you can imagine. And for that reason, if you treat this correctly, the amount of light and clarity and promotion is unfathomable. But you open up for you. In other words, it's open for you. It's your call. Are you walking into it, or are you going to slam the door on it by treating it as though this is a fluke? Instead of reacting and say, wait, this is from Hashem. Not only that, the harder it is, the higher, the loftier the source. So instead of reacting, wait, there's God here. Right now is my portal. This is it. I was looking for it. This is it. Opportunity comes a knocking. Doesn't come scratching your back. Hashem says you want it. Here it is for you. Prove it to yourself. I know you could do it. Otherwise, I wouldn't open this for you. But you've got it. It's your work. Okay, we'll continue this in Hashem tomorrow.
Rabbi, may I ask you a question, please?
Absolutely.
Why are we, the Jews, not building a Mishkan, Beta Mishkan, Beta Mikdash?
Because while the first two were man-made,
Mm-hmm.
the third is actually Tiferet. It's actually a synthesis between Hashem and us. We are building. That's exactly what we're doing. We're making a Mishkan for Hashem right here in our lives. And we're actually, once we conclude this talk towards Tisha B'Av, I told you there's a revolutionary talk that just changed everything for me regarding dealing with darkness and so on and so forth. But we are right now, that's exactly what we're doing. What we are doing right now is working on each one of ours in our lives on what the first part of the generation was in order to elevate all the sparks. And now we are here to bring everything, especially this year, a magnificent redemption. Tafshin Vav is to bring everything to Mashiach consciousness. And why is that important? To borrow an idea from what we said yesterday, if a person is 99% out of the jail cell, but their foot is stuck behind, not only they're not out, the frustration level is so much more palpable. Because they could taste it. They could feel it. They made it this far. But this one small thing is holding. We discussed yesterday, that's also problematic because with that small, with the foot being lodged, a person could be pulled right back in. Rebbe explains that with the previous Beit HaMikdash and the one before that, because the darkness wasn't transformed, there was always room for it to come back out. Even after we had the first Beit HaMikdash, even when we saw suddenly we saw 10 miracles in the Mishkan, 10 miracles in the Beit HaMikdash. Every day, somebody was emotionally depleted, just walk in and you would just immediately be charged up. With all that, there's still room for idolatry. Yes, it was a tremendous Yetzer Hara, but nevertheless it was there. There was room to look narrowly at each other and to constrain everything. Says the Rebbe, if the Beit HaMikdash the third Beit HaMikdash would be rebuilt before we resolved all the nitty-gritty of exile, it's plausible for exile to reemerge once again.
Okay, makes sense, yes.
So we are building. Our building is building in our lives. Make sure that our lives, our relationships, ourselves, our consciousness, our emotions are acting in according to Hashem, into the schematics that He gave us. and at the same time bring it to the ultimate redemption level. Then Hashem will do his.
Do we know how long it took to build each one in the past? Because you said it was years each one.
Well, this one has been taking over just about 2,000 years. So it's a little bit longer than those.
Yep.
But as we discussed yesterday, the duration of exile itself in itself is indicative of the type of light that's going to be revealed.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
All right, Kinelach. Well,
Thank
Bezat Hashem, speak tomorrow.
Thank you,
Thank you
Rabbi.
so much.
Have a great
Thank
day.
you. Thank you. Thank you.